Bold Lies by Rachel Lynch. Read by Clare Kissane. Chapter 1. George looked across the lake. It was a beauty. Like all of them, it sat serene and calm, like a feline at rest, waiting to pounce, driven by cloud and pressure from above. He peered skywards, but was satisfied that he had time to catch one more fish. His permit had always been sorted by his dear friend Alan, but that was no longer possible. The old man had enjoyed a good innings, as they say. The cricketing reference would have pleased him. That was how they'd met, after all. The boat rocked gently, and he heard the screams of children kayaking in the distance. Derwent Water was fairly quiet out of season, and large enough to cater for all tastes. The big house had its own private beach, but no one owned the lake. That belonged to everyone, and rightly so. He smiled, thinking of his daughter's laugh. He still hadn't forgotten. His line tugged, and his concentration was taken to the crystal-clear depths and a fuss under the gentle ebb and flow of the water lapping at the side of his boat. He allowed some line to be yanked away, and then reeled it in a little. Whatever it wasn't large. The poor thing also didn't give him much of a scrap, coming to the surface straight away, and practically rolling over exhausted after a minor scuffle. Snowflake generation, thought George. His mouth fell open. He'd only gone and caught a bloody Vendis. The freshwater herring was supposed to be extinct, but he'd heard rumours of a revival. He reached gently into the water and cupped the wriggling silver body. She was beautiful. He admired the colours shining off her skin, and was almost tempted to keep her. He'd been using a hook for fish much bigger than this little mite, but it had only caught the side of her mouth, and he removed it with ease, lowering her back into the water for her to revive and dart away. His day couldn't have gone better. But then he remembered that he'd forgotten to take a photograph. Now no one would believe him. He had no idea if he'd even brought his damn phone with him. He packed away his gear, then picked up the oars and headed for the private beach. There was a motorboat, of course, but he couldn't understand why anyone would want to chug toxic fumes into the clear air in this wonderful place. He gave thanks to his old friend. He would toast his memory tonight, as he always did when he came here to keep an eye on the place. The burden was not insignificant, but he understood the motives behind the decision. It had made him unpopular, but that wasn't a first, and it certainly didn't put him off. The most important thing was that he was honouring the dying wish of an old gentleman. George couldn't imagine moving here. Well, not yet anyway. There was too much invested in London. It would take years to transfer everything and make it ready, and it was a pipe dream anyhow. By the time he eased his small boat into the shingle beach, the sky was getting dark, even though it was June. The mountains could make everything turn to night if they wanted to. He glanced up at the peaks behind the house. They were covered in thick grey cloud that showed no signs of clearing. It was time to go in and make sure he had a fire lit. The kitchen was always warm, thanks to the Aga, but the main fire in the sitting room was magnificent, and George had lit it every night in remembrance of nights with Alan, sitting in front of it, sipping a 50-year-old Jano Napoleon. The cellar in the old pile was Alan's pride and joy, and George couldn't bring himself to clear it out just yet, apart from to open the odd bottle of red with dinner, of course. He never was very good at telling the difference between a bottle worth £1,000 and one from Tesco, but they all tasted good from Alan's collection. He left the boat on the beach and walked up to the house, stopping when he saw that he had a visitor. It wasn't entirely a surprise, and he held out his hand in greeting. "Come in. I'm just about to put a lasagna in the oven," he said. Their feet made scraping noises in the gravel, and George stopped outside the kitchen door to take off his Wellington boots. His visitor didn't bother. "Who were those men?" he asked. "What men?" "They drove past me on their way out. Don't tell me you've got plans for the place already." Chapter 2. Derwent Marina was quiet. The small building, set back from the beach, with seats outside and at least 50 boats and vessels for hire, was a modest operation. The car park catered for about 10 cars. The place ticked along during the winter, but saw a steady trade build from the spring onwards. There were boats and kayaks available to buy, but mainly it was rentals that brought in the steady flow of cash that enabled Graham Miller to pay his mortgage and live a comfortable life. He paid a few locals to fit buoyancy aids, size up wetsuits, and generally keep the place clean and tidy. But he ran the business and was responsible for the upkeep of the plot. The land didn't belong to him. He paid rent to a landlord who refused to sell up. In fact, most of Derwent Water's coastline was privately owned by wealthy families desperate to cling on to illustrious histories, but unsure of how to maintain their enormous estates. Most had been turned into luxury holiday homes or water sports centres. Allerdale House was no different. It stood huddled behind trees on the lake's western shore, away from the prying eyes of the tourist, crammed onto the steamer, puffing between Keswick and Lodore every day. But a kayaker, strong of arm and curious to boot, might catch a glimpse of the grand slate facade, slightly up a hill and facing east. The trees, shielding the residents from nosy visitors, had been planted over 200 years ago, and the only indication that they guarded something special was a sign on the beach that read, "Private, keep out, no landing on the beach." Graham Miller told every customer the same, and even supplied a map showing which beaches they were allowed to paddle up to. The red lines denoted no-go areas, and there were plenty of them. With Allerdale House's owner passing away after Christmas, who knew what would become of the place? At 9 a.m, the wind was insignificant, and Graham knew that it would be a good day for business. It was Whitsun week, and the kids were on half-term. Sure enough, 2 cars pulled into the car park, and children got out, looking at the water and approaching the kayaks with delight. He always recommended 2 hours for families with small kids, because he knew that it would take them at least an hour to make it out of the marina. Derwent Water was just under 3 miles long, but an inexperienced kayaker would be lucky to get halfway down before having to turn back again, either through cold or exertion. There were a few islands in between to keep them occupied, including the one where Swallows and Amazons was set, though Graham reckoned that the majority of kids hauled to the Lake District on holiday these days hadn't even heard of the book. He called one of his staff over to get the families booked in, while he checked the boathouse to see if the 3 rowing boats he'd had to pull from the water last week were repaired and varnished yet. Major repairs were carried out in the winter, and the wooden vessels had only needed a tweak or 2. The boats were his livelihood, and they needed looking after properly. To an outsider, the boatyard looked like a tip, a junkyard of detritus and bits of wood. In fact, it churned out new boats every year, and a launch was currently being renovated in the shed. The Lady of the Lake was a stunning 90-seater, a 1929 model. Once a day boat on the Amsterdam canals, then a tourist tripper on Lake Windermere. She'd made her debut on Derwent Water in 1985. She'd needed a season out of the water and a loving refurbishment. Graham swung open the doors of the main shed and admired the gleaming mahogany and oak panelling. Her name had been repainted, and she looked glorious and ready for action. He sucked in the morning air, tinged with varnish and cleaning chemicals, but something else caught his attention. Damn cats. Graham was a dog lover, and to him, cats were vermin, killing local wildlife and scavenging from the campsite 200 yards down the shore. Today, one of them had obviously caught a bird and brought it in here to rot, or perhaps something bigger, like a rat. He made a cursory circuit of the boat, finding nothing but noting that the smell was worse near the stern, especially by the cabin. He tutted. He'd have to climb up there to make sure. The last thing they needed was the lady being put back into service with an animal carcass somewhere.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?